Good afternoon. Welcome to Energy Talks. My name is Michelle Kapatz, and I'm part of the Energy Talks team in the EERE Communications Office. We're super excited to have you with us for our March program. We've recently added an opportunity to ask each speaker some questions from the audience, and we hope you'll take advantage of that. For those of you watching this through our website, apologies, but we will shut the live stream down before opening it up to questions. If you're joining us for the first time, Energy Talks is a platform for people to come and learn about offices across DOE, with speakers sharing accomplishments and successes, current programs and work, as well as some personal insights into the energy industry. You can visit our website at energy.gov/energytalks to learn more. Also, please don't forget to silence your cell phones. We have two speakers with us today. Mason Hamilton, a petroleum markets analyst with the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and Chris Irwin, a program manager from Dynamic Controls and Communications with the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. Mason will lead off today's talk with his presentation entitled, How Gasoline Gets to You, A Journey Through the Supply Chain. Mason is a principal contributor to EIA's This Week in Petroleum and Today in Energy publications, and his work and analysis spans across the petroleum and liquid fuels market spectrum, from crude to products and from pipelines to tankers. His fun fact is that when he started working with the Department of Energy, he had a full head of luscious brown hair. Also, he is known to choose vacation destinations where he's most likely to spot crude oil and petroleum product tankers. Please join me in welcoming Mason to the stage.
Thank you, and good afternoon with everybody. Thank you for joining me here in what I often call the bunker. And thank you to those of you joining via the miracle of the internet. I'd like to thank DOE Talks for having me here today. So let me start off by saying, oh wait, I don't have the clicker. That's not gonna work. Anyway, let me start off by saying a little bit more about EIA, and for those of you who aren't familiar with what we do, the Energy Information Administration is the independent statistical and analytical agency within the U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you. EIA conducts comprehensive data analysis and collection programs that cover the full spectrum of energy sources and uses and energy flows. EIA analysis and data by law is independent of approval by any other officer or employee of the U.S. government. So what this means in practicality means I can't really comment on policy proposals or the implications thereof. So fair warning for the Q&A session later. So, now that it's officially the afternoon, or not, slide forward. There we go. Go ahead one more. Let's talk, so it's the afternoon, and it's a Tuesday, so let's talk about cocktails. But a very specific cocktail, one made of hydrocarbons that we all know as motor gasoline. Now, millions of Americans are familiar with gasoline prices, whether they're going down, whether they're going up, whether they're staying the same. Fewer Americans pay attention or even care where their gasoline comes from. So today, let's go through the supply chain. Now, Americans don't really know where their gasoline comes from, and they don't pay attention. That's part of the reason, that's a testament to the reliability, flexibility, and efficiency of the supply chain. Today, let's go from crude oil all the way to your retail gasoline pump. And so hopefully, after my talk, you'll have a little bit more appreciation for how that gallon of gasoline got in your car. So, next slide, please. So, the gasoline supply chain is, like for many other transportation fuels, is very complex with many actual moving components, some of which actually move, like tankers and barges. So the gasoline supply chain is continually changing based on market conditions. So they're reacting to changes in price, refineries going up or down for maintenance, a hurricane coming, et cetera, et cetera. And the supply chain adjusts to all these things going on constantly. And for most consumers, the only thing they really notice is a small change in the price. Now, gasoline supply chain starts with crude oil and a refinery. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we start to talk about cocktails. So when crude oil is processed at a refinery, it produces a large number of liquid hydrocarbons, butane, alkylate, reformate, yada, yada, yada. When you blend it all together, it makes a bob. Now, bob's a really bad name for a cocktail, right? So, but the bob in this instance stands for the blend stock for oxidative blending. So think of this as a cocktail ready mix. You know, you go to the grocery store and you see those that say just add alcohol? Well, that's the same kind of thing here. Because in this instance, if you add ethanol, you get what's called finished gasoline. So almost all gasoline consumed in the United States is a mix of a bob with 10% ethanol by volume. Adding ethanol to a bob creates finished gasoline. Finished gasoline means it's ready for sale or use. It meets all the specifications and requirements therefore. Now, you know how some cocktails are synonymous with particular places or cities, like a Long Island iced tea, a California sunrise, a mojito in Miami, a margarita in Key West? Well, bobs are very similar. Next slide, please. For finished gasoline to meet regulations and requirements for their sale, they have to accommodate for a bunch of varying conditions. So, for example, temperature. When it's cold outside, you need gasoline to vaporize for it to combust. Controversial. Oppositely, they go back one, please. Otherwise, back, please. And back. There we go. So basically, you needed the gasoline to adjust for temperatures, whether they're too hot or too cold. And similarly, it gets hot and cold at different times of the year in different parts of the country. So California, for example, is going to start using their summer gasoline next month. There are also state and federal regulations that change what kind of formulation you use depending on where you are. So California has its own type of bob that's only sold in California. Federal regulations require that in areas where you have a little bit lower air quality, like here in the densely populated Northeast, they require that a special type of bob that burns a little bit cleaner be used. So your recipe for your gasoline cocktail changes depending on where and when you are. However, every bob produced at a refinery destined for the same market to be sold at the same time is exactly the same. So imagine as if Jimmy Buffett's margarita mix is going to be exactly the same at Jose Cuervo's right now. And we'll get to what makes it special a little bit later on. Okay, now next slide, please. Now that your gasoline cocktail ready mix is made, formulated in a way that when you add alcohol to it, it'll meet all specifications for sale and use, we need to move it. Now, ethanol has a chemical habit of attracting and mixing with water. Now, too much water in your cocktail is no good, and the same thing applies for gasoline. So to avoid this problem, ethanol is transported separately from the petroleum components of gasoline, or bobs, typically via rail. Now, the journey your bob takes to get to where your local retail station is will depend on where you live. Next slide, please. At EIA, we've inherited a way of organizing the country into regional markets. This old thing left over from World War II called Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts, or PADs. Now, these PADs do fairly well in breaking up the country into large semi-homogeneous regions, but within each PAD there are a number of smaller, unique regions that have their own supply and demand characteristics. Now, please don't try and squint at each one. We have all of these available on our website, and they're nice and big and pretty for you. Now, let's say we want to get our cocktail here in Washington, D.C. How does it get here? Next slide, please. Washington, D.C. is, of course, on the East Coast, the region or PAD with the largest gasoline consumption. But refineries on the East Coast don't produce enough gasoline to supply that demand. While just over half of all U.S. refinery capacity is concentrated in the Gulf Coast. Now, pipeline infrastructures link these two regions, supplemented with some international trade, play the key roles in balancing this mismatch between supply and demand in the regions. Now notice there are no refineries in DC, Maryland, or Virginia. And also notice there are no refineries between Alabama and Delaware. Instead, next slide please, the DC metro area is largely supplied from the Gulf Coast via two pipelines, the Colonial Pipeline and the Plantation Pipeline. These two pipelines deliver gasoline throughout the East Coast, with Colonial going from Houston, Texas, all the way to New York City, and the Plantation Pipeline starting at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and ending here in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. These two pipelines, like many others in the United States, supply more than just gasoline. They supply gasoline, diesel, heating oil, jet fuel. In fact, there is a pipeline delivering jet fuel to Reagan National Airport that runs parallel to Metro's blue and yellow line in Northern Virginia. These pipelines work by pumping in batches, with one batch going in and pushing another batch out the other end. And when it goes out, it's separated into special tanks at a distribution terminal. These pipelines connecting our area to the Gulf Coast is the reason why when a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, our gasoline prices here in Washington go up. That's because that's where our supplies come from. Next slide, please. Now that we've made our bob and transported it to a distribution terminal, it's time for the last leg of the journey, from terminal to retail station. Next slide, please. Now, refineries and pipelines get a lot of the headlines, but it's actually distribution terminals that do some of the most important work in the entire supply chain. First and foremost, that's because this is where the local inventories are held. So let's say there's a big snowstorm. Everybody stops driving. Well, the terminal inventories will probably build up because nobody's driving. Or, God forbid, there's a nice warm summer weekend like in March, and people go driving all the time. Well, the demand will go up. The inventories at this terminal do a lot better job of responding to these ups and downs in supply and demand than, let's say, a refinery that's 1,400 miles away. Distribution terminals also are where we complete our cocktail. This is where we add the ethanol and the alcohol to our bob. Fun fact, the tank on that far left, the stuff with the black stuff growing on it, that's the tank with the ethanol in it. Now that black stuff is actually a fungus that feeds on ethanol vapors. So if you go to Kentucky where they make bourbon, all the barns are painted black. And that's because during the days of Prohibition, they didn't want to get caught storing and making moonshine, so they painted all their barns black. Distribution terminals also are where, do what the name implies, they distribute. They're the ones filling up the tanker trucks that we see on the roads going to the retail stations down the street from where we live. This is also where gasoline gets a brand. So remember how I said refineries all produce similar gasoline? Well, this is where they add the additives and detergents and special things that make you have Chevron with Techron, Shell V-Power, BP Invigorate, whatever and whatever and whatever. So think of this is where Jimmy Buffett adds his special ingredient that gets you to Margaritaville. Then distribution terminals do what the name implies. They deliver to your retail station. And in Northern Virginia, this is where a majority of our region is supplied from, in Washington, D.C. And two of the biggest terminals you can actually pass on 95 in Newington, Virginia. Next slide, please. Now, this entire journey from refinery to pump only represents about 22%, roughly, of the cost of retail gasoline. The rest is crude oil and taxes. And the current U.S. average retail price for regular gasoline, as EIA reported yesterday, was $2.56 a gallon. So that gallon started out as crude oil, came out of the ground, went into a refinery, processed into a bunch of hydrocarbons, blended into a bob, shipped it via pipeline 1,400 miles, stored at a distribution terminal, ethanol and detergents added, put on a tanker truck, delivered to your retail station, all for $2.56 a gallon. So for some perspective, one of our favorite local craft breweries here in Washington, at my local grocery store, their beer goes for $19.20 a gallon. So some comparison. Next slide, please. Now, where does EIA fit in this whole picture? EIA collects and distributes and publishes and analyzes all the data that we collect throughout the entire supply chain. We help see what's going and show what's going on in this specific, in each stage of the supply chain via our data. How much ethanol was blended with gasoline in the West Coast last month? That'll be in our data. How much gasoline was moved from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast via pipeline? That'll be in EIA data. What was the price of gasoline in Cleveland last Monday? That will be in EIA data. So that's how EIA adds value to the supply chain, explains what's going on, and contributes to EIA's mission and to DOE's mission. And with that, I'd like to thank you for going on this somewhat awkward journey. And now that I have a hankering for a cocktail, I'll end with cheers. That was awkward.
Thank you, Mason, for that informative presentation. Happy hour, anyone? If you'd like to learn more about his work, you can ask him at the end of his presentations. Next up is Chris Irwin, whose presentation is titled, Can We Uber the Grid? Applying Sharing Economy Ideas to Electricity. Chris has spent over 22 years in a diverse spectrum of high technology fields, from HVAC to semiconductor manufacturing, communication networks, and smart grid infrastructure. At OE, he has managed over $1.6 billion in grid modernization projects. As for his fun fact, Chris once shared the back of a Russian cargo jet with 8 African elephants. Sounds like quite an amazing adventure. Please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage.
Thanks, Michelle. So I've got wonderful notes. I'm probably not going to refer to them once. And I'm going to pretend that the clicker doesn't work. And so if we can just go to the next slide. So show of hands, does anybody use Uber? Anybody? Ooh, many, many. Excellent, excellent. So what does it mean when we're trying to Uber the grid? What kind of research is entailed with taking this kind of an adventure? Essentially, what you're doing with Uber you are outsourcing the need for a transportation service. You need that transportation service. You don't want to get your car out. You don't want to pay for parking. You'd like to make that transport without doing anything except for touching a couple of buttons and making a little bit of money move. So what we're talking about here is that you are outsourcing that service. You can call it crowdsourcing, which is the case with Uber and that sharing economy model, contracting, but that's essentially what we're doing here. So the question is, why is this worth trying on the grid? What critical things get outsourced today where we can gain a little bit of confidence that this is worth trying? And why isn't this a home run right now? So if we can go to the next slide. So we've got about 3 different forces at work here that's making this a good idea. We have more and more distributed generation, small-scale generation coming online in the United States. So it could be solar panels on rooftops, it could be small-scale wind generation, or it could be energy storage or electric vehicles. But essentially what we call it is distributed energy resources, is these things that are capable of being a partner in the generation quotient of the grid. The second effect that we have here going on is the fact is that we want more performance out of our existing grid. We have higher standards for power quality. We've got a lot of digital devices out there. We find storms increasingly annoying, and power outages basically stop our economy in its tracks. I, for one, was without utility power for 58 hours 2 weekends ago. So that was a fun adventure for me. And then the final thing is that if there is a distributed resource out there, be it a solar panel or a refrigerator or a pool pump or an electric vehicle, chances are it's connected. And so what we have here as we go through it is more DER, more complex, and lots of connectivity out there. Now, to get more performance out of the system, you have to spend more money generally. That's what you get. And a good example of getting more performance for a more complex system with more expense has to do with anti-lock brakes. So anti-lock brakes were born about 50 years ago, and they were used in aircraft, is when you're trying to stop an aircraft before it reaches the end of the runway. And so it was a difficult operation. It was very important, but it was really expensive. And so only aircraft could afford it. Go forward another 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, and you have luxury automobiles that are using anti-lock braking for some important things so that people in those Lincoln Continentals wouldn't skid off the road quite so disastrously. But again, move forward in time. Complexity is still there, but the costs are going down. It moves into motorcycles. BMW motorcycles were early adopters of anti-lock braking. And then pickup trucks, because the back end of the pickup truck would always slide out. So you've got this complexity that's desirable performance and it's moving down that food chain. So what we get when we're talking about the Uber example and the grid is we'd really like to do some research and development so we can accelerate a 50-year adoption pattern for anti-lock brakes and compress it into something a little bit more realistic for our needs. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So the beautiful thing about connectivity is that if you have to pay for it yourself, all by yourself, it's going to be really expensive. But other people's connectivity, where they're getting devices connected without you having to pay them to do it, other people's connectivity is cheap. Other people's complexity, where the act of connecting all these billions of devices is ridiculously complex, but somebody else has done it. And so that's a beautiful thing because we get that connectivity, which is important because the grid doesn't need your participation all the time. The grid needs different things at different times. If I can't reach you with that, then we're not going to be able to have a good exchange here. One other interesting thing is if you see this little tiny red dot over here, that is the number of electricity meters in the United States. We have about 160 million electricity meters, and most utilities pay for them to be connected to the utility in some way so they can be read automatically. They pay a lot for that connectivity, and up there we've got 50 billion other devices that are just waiting. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Where are those three trends taking us? High distributed energy resources. We've got lots of them. We want more performance, and we've got tons of connectivity. So through earlier investments in the grid, we've got that stage one. We're really good on that front. Now we're moving into stage two, where we're getting more solar on the grid, and it's starting to become a little bit of a pain point. Both Hawaii and California are struggling with how do we get more solar on without it destabilizing portions of the grid. We want to solve it because we want that energy from that resource. So we have to figure out a way to integrate it into our control systems and to be able to anticipate solar moving on and electric vehicles charging overnight and things like that. Ultimately, when we get to a point in stage three where there are so many distributed energy resources, it no longer becomes possible to coordinate them directly, where we reach out and we control each one individually. And also, it's not cool with people for the utility to reach in and control when your car is charging and when your air conditioner is on and more like that. So we want to reach all those devices, but we need a fair and transparent way to do that. And what we're doing is we're doing that through markets. So we've got that Uber example. We like that ability to use flexibility. But this is the electric grid. If the lights go out, everybody has a bad day. And so how can we come to trust this outsourcing mechanism enough to move forward? So I wanted to go through a couple of examples of where we're outsourcing something that's important to us today. Next slide, please. So, shocker, Ford doesn't make everything in their cars. This is actually kind of the obvious example. You know that they don't make everything in that car. And so they already have an outsourcing model where they've decided what's important to Ford and Chevy and GM and what can they outsource to have it made more cheaply, more reliably, and more flexibly. But moving forward in time, what you see is the most important parts of vehicle manufacturing and being a car company are going to get tighter because there are more and more capabilities, more innovation that needs to be accommodated. And so we can move into the next example of we couldn't possibly outsource, next slide, our national science mission, but we do. And so from our Wikipedia page, is that 16 of the 17 DOE national laboratories are administered, managed, operated, and staffed by private sector organizations. Do we do it without thinking about it? No. Do we have strong relationships with these outfits and make sure that all of the promises are being kept and that we're delivering on that national mission? Yes. Do we hold the advancements of our scientific research establishment very dear to our hearts? Absolutely. So again, we're looking for something that we would never consider outsourcing it until we find the right way to do that. And finally, the last slide. There is no way we could outsource war. But in truth, we've been doing it since the Civil War. But the most important thing to observe here is that over time, our reliance on contracted personnel has been going up to the point where in Afghanistan, about 60% of the warfighting apparatus was through contractor personnel. And that's kind of amazing because our military and our national defense is extremely important to us. So when we talk about trying to break down barriers, how do we do that within the grid? We have reasons to be confident that this is something worth doing research and development on. Next slide, please. So we just do it, right? I mean, we just move forward. But let's go back to that Uber example. Uber facilitates transactions for services between people that include promises. So when we move it into the grid, we have to line up all that connected, capable customer flexibility with exactly what the grid needs. If you offered me a very delicious lunch right now, I would not be able to accept it because that would be rude to you. So we have to line up that flexibility with the needs to make sure that everybody has something that the other wants. Second of all, it has to be win-win. Utility has to get something out of it, get a service for cheaper than they could buy and install it themselves. And you need to get paid for something that you like. If you want to defer charging or something like that, show me the money. Show me a reason for us both to have a transaction happen. And finally, opposite of the Uber example is a broken promise in the grid doesn't mean you don't get to Toys R Us. It means that the lights might flicker, or in bad cases, the lights could go out. So how do we make those promises and keep those promises in a way that gives us confidence that this is worth doing? So, move into the next slide here. Of course, we're not going to call it Uber or something catchy. We're going to call it Transactive Energy. Transactions that advance the purpose of our energy infrastructure. When we're doing this, we're trying to create the incentives between these two parties that coordinate that distributed energy resource voluntarily. It's absolutely critical that we respect the ownership of the people who own those assets and that we engage with them on a fair and transparent basis. Secondly, we want to have a stable, controllable system at the end of the day. If you outsource it and all goes to heck in a handbasket, that is not the outcome that we are gunning for. And so it's very important that we have a simulation and modeling research agenda to make sure that these experiments are done in the computer simulation as opposed to in the real world. Finally, when we get all of those distributed assets coordinated with themselves, what we get are a series of benefits that we think are worth pursuing. We get a more decentralized control system, which is tougher and in some cases faster than the centralized control where the utility controls all today. So you get to have some toughness that comes from distributed controls. Secondarily, we are pursuing through research and development how to have high integrity transactions. How can each person trust that this transaction is good? They've done it in Uber. We need to do it in a slightly different way in the grid. But we're certainly looking at blockchain technologies to make sure that everybody can trust that the transactions happened and that their money is going to get paid. Additionally, on that side is that we need to make sure that the promises that we make to each other are enforceable. And so there's a technology out there that's called smart contracts, which have to do with machine-readable agreements between machines and things like that. And that's also part of our research agenda here today. Finally, I wanted to say that we are not pursuing Transactive Energy R&D alone. We have a partner in the Building Technologies Office of EERE. They have a companion transactive control program. And that's kind of essential because if you don't have a buyer and a seller, you don't have a transaction. So the grid can't sell to itself. That's what we do today. So we need to have that partnership. And of course, smart buildings are like a premier opportunity for us to exchange grid services with. And they are extremely good at recognizing value since they are called businesses. So if we can go to the final slide, is one thing I wanted to make clear is that in this Uber example, the utilities who operate the energy network, the utilities are not the taxi cabs. For the most part, the utilities are not that threatened in this kind of an example because the utilities don't represent taxis, they represent the roads. They represent all of the connections between all of these energy devices and the larger grid. And so what we're trying to do with this research agenda is that by 2030 is to have our distribution systems use all this dynamically sourced control and get those grid services from all that distributed energy resource that's out there. And we want it to be sourced as easily and confidently as they get it from the transmission system today and from the assets that they install, own, and operate on the distribution grid. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. Before we say goodbye to folks watching from our live stream, I want to give a shout out to our April 10th series. I think. There we go. And we hope to see you then. Please reach out to us at energytalks@ee.doe.gov if you have any questions. And now we're going to open things up to questions